Sunday evening, January 15th, 1989. Paul Salmon told his wife he was going bowling with colleagues. He had said that same morning he didn't feel like going. But after a 50-minute phone call in the kitchen, a call Betty Jeanne couldn't hear, he suddenly changed his mind, packed his bag, and left. He did go to the bowling alley. He greeted his colleagues. He sat and watched for a few minutes. Then he stood up, said nothing, walked out, got in his car, and drove to the Holiday Inn. He wasn't going bowling. He was meeting his mistress. Her name was Carolyn Warmus. She was 25. They had met 2 years earlier when she joined his school as a new teacher. The attraction was immediate, so was everything that followed. They sat at the bar of the hotel restaurant, a dark, quiet place Paul liked for exactly that reason. They talked for hours, drank, ate oysters. At one point, Paul said he hoped he would one day dance at her wedding and see her happy. She looked at him and said, "What about your happiness, Paul? Don't you deserve to be happy?" They left together. They sat in her car in a dark corner of the parking lot. Then they said goodbye and agreed to meet again soon. Paul drove home. He walked through the door, and his life changed forever. Betty Jeanne was lying on the living room floor in a pool of blood. The television was blaring, the lights were off, the phone cord had been pulled from the wall. She had been shot 6 times, and Paul had just spent the evening with the woman who, investigators would later conclude, had pulled the trigger. This is the story of Carolyn Warmus, a woman the press called a fatal attraction, a name that felt almost too fitting, because the film it referenced had been shot in the same county where Betty Jeanne Salman was murdered. She had been shot 9 times, in the shoulder, the arm, the left knee, the lower leg, the back of the head, and then several more times in the back, fired at close range, as if the attacker wanted to make absolutely certain there was no chance she would survive. By the early hours of the morning, Paul was already at the police station, where detectives began carefully reconstructing everything he had done that evening, moving step by step through the timeline of his movements. At first, it sounded ordinary. Bowling, colleagues, a routine Sunday. But then the story shifted. He told them about the phone call, the one that had come earlier that evening while he was in the kitchen. It was Carolyn Warmus, and the conversation lasted nearly an hour, moving from casual details about his daughter's basketball game to something far more personal. Somewhere during that call, the plan for the evening changed. They agreed to meet at Treetops, a quiet restaurant inside the Holiday Inn, a place they already knew well enough to feel comfortable, and private enough not to draw attention. Paul didn't hide the relationship. He described it in detail, the meetings, the notes left at work, the calls that reached him even at home, each piece forming a pattern that had been building for months. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added something else. After dinner, they had gone out to the parking lot and sat in her car, where the relationship crossed another line. Detectives would later say that this was the moment his tone changed. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. There was a trace of discomfort, of something closer to shame, tied not only to the affair itself, but to the timing, because by then his wife was already dead. A few days later, Carolyn Warmus was asked to come in for questioning, and according to Detective Constantino, her response stood out for its ease. She agreed immediately, politely saying she would come right away, without hesitation or visible concern. When she arrived at the station, detectives informed her about what had happened to Betty Jeanne, and her reaction appeared sincere. She seemed shocked and quickly asked about Paul and his daughter Kristen, trying to understand how they were coping. At that point, investigators made it clear that Paul was their primary suspect and that he was still in the building, being questioned in another unit. Carolyn struggled to accept that possibility, describing Paul's behavior during their last meeting as entirely normal. Attentive, friendly, even warm. And she added that he had spoken about his wife with affection, insisting that he loved Betty Jeanne. Despite this, Detective Constantino remained unconvinced and continued to pursue other lines of inquiry. Investigators explored alternative theories, a robbery, a contract killing, but each fell apart under scrutiny. By the spring of 1989, progress had slowed significantly. Detectives revisited witnesses, retraced timelines, and re-examined details, yet none of it produced meaningful results. Paul eventually hired an attorney, and during a subsequent interview conducted in his presence, he attempted to redirect attention by suggesting that investigators look into another man, his wife's boss, John, with whom he claimed Betty Jeanne had been involved. John was brought in that same day and initially denied any relationship, presenting himself simply as her employer. However, as the seriousness of the situation became clear, he admitted that there had been an affair that had lasted for several years, though it had ended well before the murder. His alibi for the night of the crime was confirmed, and he was eliminated as a suspect. With no alternative leads holding, suspicion returned to Paul, who remained under close scrutiny and was questioned repeatedly, maintaining the same version of events each time. Months later, however, the direction of the investigation began to shift, as attention gradually moved away from Paul and toward Carolyn Warmus, largely due to emerging accounts of her persistent and increasingly intrusive behavior toward him. In June 1989, she followed Paul to Puerto Rico, where he was vacationing with another woman, Barbara Baylor, a fellow teacher from his school. Rather than confronting them directly, Carolyn chose a different approach. Posing as a police officer, she called Barbara's husband from the island and informed him about the affair. After returning from Puerto Rico, Barbara was so shaken by the experience that she sought and eventually obtained a restraining order against Carolyn. On the advice of his attorney, Paul cut off all contact with Carolyn shortly after the murder, a decision she struggled to accept, which led to a noticeable decline in her mental state. On August 8th, emergency services were called to her Manhattan apartment after neighbors reported hearing her screaming inside, and she was subsequently admitted to the psychiatric unit at Metropolitan Hospital, where she remained for 7 days. Around this time, investigators turned their attention to Carolyn's phone records, carefully reviewing every call made from her apartment in the critical period surrounding the murder. Among those contacts, one number drew particular interest. It belonged to Vincent Parco, a private investigator based in Manhattan, whom Carolyn had contacted multiple times both before and after Betty Jeanne's death. When questioned, Parco confirmed that Carolyn had been his client and had hired him to look into a man she had once been involved with, someone she was clearly unwilling to let go. The work had been completed, yet even after Parco was no longer doing anything for her, Carolyn continued to contact him from time to time, occasionally suggesting they meet in person and even hinting at something more intimate, offers he consistently declined. At a later stage, Parco chose to expand on his original statement, adding a detail that shifted the tone of the investigation. Shortly before Betty Jeanne's murder, Carolyn had asked him where she could obtain a firearm, explaining that she needed it for protection, although her insistence suggested a level of determination that went beyond a casual concern for safety. As he described it, this was not a single question but a recurring request, one that came up repeatedly in their conversations, each time with increasing persistence, to the point where it became difficult to ignore. She also asked about a suppressor. At first, Parko refused to assist her, but in early January 1989, he eventually gave in and sold her a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol equipped with a suppressor for $2,500. The weapon had passed through several hands before reaching Carolyn, modified with the suppressor built specifically for that firearm. During a subsequent search of the workshop, investigators discovered a spent .25 caliber casing beneath the table, which was later sent to the Westchester County Laboratory for analysis. When specialists compared that casing to the shell casings recovered from the floor near Betty Jeanne's body, the result was conclusive. They matched. For Detective Constantino, this was a turning point, as the chain of evidence now connected the weapon that had passed from Parko to Peters, and ultimately to Carolyn Warmus, directly to the murder. From that moment, the investigation gained a level of clarity it had lacked before, supported not by speculation, but by physical evidence that could be traced and verified. For investigators, phone records often become one of the most valuable sources of information, as patterns of calls and connections can reveal movements, intentions, and decisions that remain invisible in any other form of evidence. Detective Constantino focused closely on the calls made on January 15th, 1989, carefully reviewing each number dialed from Carolyn's Manhattan apartment during the critical window surrounding the murder. Several calls stood out, including repeated contact with Parko both before and after the crime. Yet one particular call, made that afternoon, drew special attention. The number traced back to New Jersey. When checked against directory records, it led to a gun shop in North Plainfield, located approximately 35 kilometers west of Manhattan, a distance that raised immediate questions about why someone would travel that far for such a purchase. Detectives visited the shop and found records of a recent ammunition purchase, made by a woman from out of the area using a New York driver's license. The distance, combined with the timing, made the purchase stand out. The name recorded in the log was Lisa Katai, and according to the store's documentation, she had presented a New York state driver's license as identification. Detectives followed the lead to her apartment, where she initially refused to speak with them, but changed her position once she understood that her name had appeared in a murder investigation and agreed to explain her situation. She stated that she had never been to the store, had never purchased ammunition, and had no connection to the transaction in question, then added a detail that immediately reframed the situation. The previous summer, she had lost her driver's license and later obtained a replacement through the Department of Motor Vehicles. A duplicate she showed to detectives as proof that the original document had gone missing and could have been used by someone else. That summer, she had been working alongside another woman, Carolyn Warmus, a connection that immediately caught investigators' attention and, as Detective Constantino later admitted, was almost impossible to ignore once it became clear. By that point, police already had access to Carolyn's phone records, which showed that just hours before the murder, a call had been placed to a gun shop in New Jersey. At the same time, store records confirmed that a woman had purchased .25 caliber ammunition, the same type later used in the killing of Betty Jeanne Salmon, using identification that belonged to a woman who not only knew Carolyn, but had worked with her. It was the kind of detail that shifted a case. New York tabloids quickly labeled it the Fatal Attraction murder, and the name stuck. On February 2, 1989, Carolyn Warmus was formally charged with second-degree murder and possession of an unregistered firearm. However, 6 months later, the indictment was dismissed by Judge John Carey after it emerged that the prosecution had failed to inform the grand jury that Vincent Parco had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony regarding the sale of the weapon. The setback was temporary. Prosecutors quickly secured a new indictment, and the highly publicized trial of Carolyn Warmus, widely associated with the fatal attraction narrative, began on February 14, 1991, a date that carried its own unmistakable symbolism. To understand how the case reached this point, investigators and journalists alike began to look more closely at Carolyn's background. Carolyn Warmus was born in 1964 in Michigan, the eldest daughter of a wealthy insurance executive. Her parents divorced bitterly when she was 8. She rarely saw either of them after that, a detail those who later studied her behavior did not consider insignificant. After finishing high school, Carolyn went on to study at the University of Michigan, where she later earned a degree in education, eventually completing her master's at Teachers College. During her student years, a pattern had already begun to form. She became involved with several married men, relationships that rarely ended on her terms and often left her feeling rejected, which seemed to deepen a tendency toward attachment that quickly turned into something more intense and difficult to manage. In 1983, her first documented incident involved a teaching assistant named Paul Lavin. When he ended their brief relationship and became engaged, she left threatening notes, falsely claimed she was pregnant, and forced him to obtain a restraining order. This was not an isolated pattern. Before meeting Paul Salmon in 1987, Carolyn had another brief relationship with a married bartender, during which she contacted Vincent Parco, a private investigator, and hired him to follow the man and document his interactions with his wife. In another short-lived relationship, she went as far as studying with a rabbi and converting to Judaism in an attempt to win the approval of a man who was already engaged to someone else, a decision that further illustrated how far she was willing to go to maintain a connection. By the mid-1980s, she had moved to New York, enrolled at Columbia University, and completed her master's degree in 1987, a set of academic achievements that impressed those who later worked with her and helped her secure a teaching position at an elementary school that same year. It was there that she met Paul Salmon. He was 40. She was 23. He quickly became her mentor, someone who guided her through her first months at the school, and their relationship, which began as professional and cooperative, soon shifted into something more personal. One afternoon, near the end of the school day, Paul stopped by her classroom and mentioned that a group of teachers was planning to meet at a nearby bar, asking if she would like to join them, an invitation she accepted without hesitation. When she arrived, however, it was only the two of them. Paul was married, something Carolyn knew, yet he behaved as though that boundary carried little weight, rarely wearing his wedding ring and engaging with her in a way that blurred any clear distinction between colleague and something else. The attraction was mutual. He was intelligent, attentive, and consistently present in ways that made him easy to rely on, while Carolyn's youth, confidence, and carefully maintained appearance were qualities he found difficult to ignore. Their meetings became more frequent. Paul told her that his marriage operated under an open arrangement, suggesting that his wife also saw other men, a claim that removed, at least on the surface, any immediate sense of conflict. Most of their time together was spent at Carolyn's apartment on the Upper East Side, where privacy allowed the relationship to develop without interruption. For Carolyn, however, this was never a casual affair. She did not see herself as someone on the periphery of Paul's life, but as part of it, a presence that extended beyond him and into the world he shared with his wife and daughter, a boundary that, for her, had already begun to dissolve. Over time, the boundaries between their lives began to blur in ways that felt increasingly unnatural, even if, on the surface, everything still appeared acceptable. Betty Jeanne and Carolyn started speaking regularly on the phone, occasionally meeting to shop together, and from the outside, Betty Jeanne treated her with consistent kindness, never showing signs of suspicion or discomfort. Carolyn attended Kristen's basketball games, sitting in the stands alongside Paul and Betty Jeanne, cheering as if she were part of the family, and she joined them for outings, including a Christmas performance in Manhattan, blending into their lives with a quiet confidence that made her presence seem almost ordinary. She gave expensive gifts to Paul's daughter, once even taking her on a ski trip to a private country club, actions that suggested not distance, but involvement, a level of closeness that went beyond what most people would consider appropriate. For Carolyn, this was not a temporary arrangement. She wanted continuity, something lasting, even as she seemed aware, at least on some level, that the situation stood on unstable ground. When she accepted a position at another school with better conditions, the move did not interrupt the relationship. Instead, it continued evolving in a way that grew more intense over time. In December, Paul sent her a card in which he wrote that he was falling deeply in love, a gesture that appeared to confirm what she had already begun to believe. 6 months later, however, his position shifted. He suggested they should end the relationship. The contrast was sharp, and for Carolyn, difficult to accept. She told him that life without him no longer felt meaningful, a statement he dismissed with a certain detachment, asking her not to dramatize the situation. By August 1988, the tension had become visible. On Kristen's 15th birthday, at a time when Paul claimed he had stepped back from the relationship, Carolyn appeared unannounced at the family's apartment, bringing gifts, 2 outfits, and an expensive bracelet, a gesture that felt less like generosity and more like an intrusion into a space she was no longer meant to occupy. It unsettled him. Around that same period, Carolyn confided in a university friend, Ryan Atkinson, admitting that the relationship was not developing in the way she wanted, and describing a plan that revealed a different level of intention. She considered hiring a private investigator to expose Paul's infidelity to his wife, not to reveal her own involvement, but to destabilize the marriage itself. After Betty Jeanne's death, just weeks before Kristen's 16th birthday, a pale blue Tiffany box appeared at the door of their apartment, containing diamond stud earrings and a note signed, "With love, Carolyn," a gesture that carried a weight that felt deeply out of place under the circumstances. In a later phone conversation with the same friend, she spoke about the future with a striking certainty, describing a life in which, with her resources, Paul and his daughter would eventually form something she considered ideal. By the time the case reached court, media attention had intensified to an extraordinary degree. Television crews and reporters gathered daily in the lobby of the Westchester County Courthouse, turning each development into a public event, while headlines framed the story in increasingly dramatic terms. From the first day, Carolyn's appearance dominated the coverage. Designer clothing, composed posture, the kind of presence that cameras found impossible to ignore. Each day, she appeared carefully composed, dressed in designer clothing, projecting an image that some observers compared to a figure from a film, controlled, confident, and aware of the attention she commanded. Yet beneath that composure, there were moments when something else surfaced. her expression would shift unexpectedly, her smile interrupted by a brief, almost involuntary movement that suggested tension beneath the surface, a detail that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. The prosecution was led by Assistant DA James McCarthy. Carolyn retained David Lewis, a well-known criminal defense attorney. When the trial began in early 1991, it unfolded under intense media attention, with every appearance, every statement, and every detail examined in real time, as Carolyn once again entered the courtroom dressed in a way that drew attention. A choice that unsettled even her own attorney, while reinforcing the image that had already taken hold in the public eye. She sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 bodyguards, her posture controlled, her movements minimal, rarely turning her head as if determined to remain composed under the weight of constant scrutiny. On February 7, 1991, Paul Salmon took the stand and told the jury what he knew about the night his wife died, stepping into a role that placed his private life under a level of examination few people ever experience. The defense, led by David Lewis, sought to reshape the narrative, presenting Paul not simply as a grieving husband, but as a man whose history of deception and infidelity could suggest a different motive entirely. Lewis argued that this was a person who had lied repeatedly, to his wife, to himself, and for his own convenience, in order to maintain his relationship with Carolyn. Dressed in a dark suit, Paul appeared visibly uncomfortable on the witness stand, as intimate details of his personal life were brought into the open, his past relationships dissected in front of the jury in a way that stripped away any remaining privacy. He spoke about the state of his marriage, describing it as troubled, and acknowledged a series of affairs over the years, including his relationship with Carolyn. He recounted the night he returned home and found Betty Jeanne lying on the living room floor, a moment that, even in the structured environment of the courtroom, carried a lingering sense of shock. Paul admitted that he felt guilt about his involvement with Carolyn and said that he had wanted to end the relationship, explaining that although they had not been intimate during the summer of 1988, they resumed seeing each other later that year despite his growing uncertainty. He told the jury about their meeting at the Holiday Inn in Yonkers, where he had tried to persuade her to move on and find happiness elsewhere, suggesting that whatever existed between them could not continue. He also described a later visit, during which he asked her directly whether she had been involved in Betty Jeanne's death. A question he said he asked because he felt the need to confront the possibility, even if it seemed unlikely at the time. According to Paul, Carolyn did not react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she responded calmly, saying she was glad he felt comfortable enough to ask, and assured him that she had nothing to do with it, a statement he told the jury he believed completely. Prosecutor McCarthy then shifted the focus, drawing out details about Carolyn's behavior after the murder, including the incident in Puerto Rico, where she followed Paul and his new partner despite having no prior knowledge of his travel plans, a development that left him unsettled enough to contact hotel security, notify local police in Greenburgh, and leave the island that same night. When the prosecution concluded its questioning, the defense moved in. David Lewis, who had prepared for this moment carefully, began a methodical cross-examination designed to reshape how the jury viewed Paul, focusing on his past and his credibility rather than the events of a single night. Lewis methodically attacked Paul's credibility, portraying him as a habitual liar who manipulated those around him for personal convenience. The strategy was clear. If the jury could be persuaded to question Paul's integrity, then doubt could begin to spread through the rest of the case. That doubt deepened when financial details emerged. Lewis revealed that Paul had received significant payments connected to the case, including an advance of $25,000, with the possibility of a much larger sum if a film adaptation moved forward, as well as additional fees for consultation. The implication was difficult to ignore. Any sympathy the jury may have felt began to erode, replaced by uncertainty about his motives and the role he might have played in the events surrounding his wife's death. After 6 days of testimony, often tense and at times contradictory, Paul left the stand visibly exhausted, his credibility weakened and his position in the eyes of the jury far less certain than when he had first taken his seat. Even years later, he continued to live in the same apartment where the murder had taken place, a detail that added a final layer of unease to a story that had already blurred the line between personal tragedy and public spectacle. When Vincent Parco took the stand, his presence immediately drew attention. Over time, their professional relationship shifted into something more complicated, and Parco told the court that Carolyn had repeatedly asked him to obtain a firearm for her, explaining that she needed it for protection, although her persistence suggested a deeper intent. He also revealed another detail that added weight to the prosecution's case. Carolyn had told him that she possessed identification that did not belong to her, explaining that a colleague from her school had left a wallet unattended in a locker room, a circumstance she appeared to have taken advantage of. According to Parco, the day after the murder, Carolyn called him and mentioned that the wife of a teacher at her school had been attacked, describing the incident in terms that felt strikingly specific, as though she already knew details that had not yet been widely reported, while at the same time insisting that she had denied any involvement when questioned by police. The defense moved quickly to challenge his credibility. David Lewis portrayed Parco as an unreliable witness, a man whose profession had involved deception, manipulation, and questionable methods, arguing before the jury that someone capable of falsifying documents and conducting illegal surveillance could just as easily distort the truth in a courtroom. At the same time, the defense emphasized a critical gap in the prosecution's case. There was no direct physical evidence placing Carolyn inside the Salmon apartment on the night of the murder. Then came the testimony that introduced a different layer of complexity. Linda Viana, a telephone operator, recalled a call she would never forget. A voice on the line saying, "He's killing me." Words that had been recorded during a call placed from the Salmon apartment on the night of the murder. At first glance, it seemed like a desperate plea from a woman in her final moments. Yet, under closer examination, the details raised difficult questions. The call had originated from a phone located in the dining area of the apartment, a phone that investigators later found on the floor, disconnected from the wall. Betty Jeanne's body, however, had been discovered in the living room, where the majority of the blood was concentrated, with no trace of blood near the phone itself. During closing arguments, Prosecutor McCarthy asked the jury to consider what that meant. If Betty Jeanne had made the call while under attack, there would likely have been blood near the phone, and she would have had to dial 911 while already injured, using a rotary phone that required time and precision, all while facing an armed attacker. The wording of the call added another layer of uncertainty. The operator could not say with confidence whether the voice had said he or she, a distinction that became central to the interpretation of what had actually happened in those final moments. McCarthy suggested a different possibility. If the call had been staged, it could have served a specific purpose, to establish a precise timeline of the attack and ensure that Paul appeared to be somewhere else at that exact moment, effectively providing him with a strong alibi. In that scenario, the call was not a cry for help, but a calculated move. And if Carolyn Warmus had placed it, as the prosecution argued. Then it reflected a level of planning that extended far beyond the act itself, shaping not only how the crime was committed, but how it would be understood afterward. By placing that call and speaking the words, "He's killing me," as if they had come from Betty Jeanne, she may have done more than create a moment of panic. She may have shaped the narrative from the very beginning, distancing herself from suspicion while reinforcing the impression of an attack that unfolded in real time. Detective Constantino also considered another possibility, one that added complexity to the case. Given Carolyn's resources and determination, it was conceivable that she could have arranged for someone else to carry out the killing, even though the physical evidence increasingly pointed toward her direct involvement. When he took the stand, Constantino presented the case as a continuous chain of events, tracing it from the first moments at the crime scene through months of investigation marked by repeated interviews, setbacks, long nights, and the kind of sustained focus that comes from working a single case without interruption. By that stage, few people understood its details more thoroughly than he did. As the testimony unfolded, a pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. The case against Carolyn Warmus rested not on a single decisive piece of evidence, but on a growing network of circumstantial elements that, taken together, formed a coherent narrative. Forensic experts confirmed that the shell casings matched, while Lisa Katai's testimony added another layer, as she stated under oath that she had never purchased ammunition in New Jersey, and explained that her driver's license had been lost or stolen during the summer she worked in Manhattan, at a time when she was in contact with Carolyn, who could have had access to her belongings. The prosecution also introduced Carolyn's phone records from January 15th, 1989, highlighting a 5-minute call placed to a New Jersey gun shop shortly after her lengthy conversation with Paul, a sequence that aligned closely with the purchase of ammunition using Katai's identification and strengthened the case against her. On April 16, 1991, David Lewis delivered his closing argument, focusing on the absence of direct evidence and urging the jury to consider what had not been seen. No witness had observed Carolyn entering the building, carrying a weapon, assembling a suppressor, committing the shooting, or leaving the scene, a gap he presented as central to reasonable doubt. In response, Assistant District Attorney James McCarthy offered a different interpretation, arguing that the crime had been planned months in advance, possibly as early as the summer of 1988, and pointing to the phone records as a timeline that revealed intent. During her 55-minute call with Paul on the day of the murder, she learned that his daughter would be away for the weekend and that Betty Jeanne would be alone, after which she arranged to meet him later that evening, and within half an hour of ending the call, contacted the gun shop in New Jersey. Investigators established that Betty Jeanne died later that same evening, at a time that aligned with this sequence of events, while a witness at the Holiday Inn confirmed that Paul arrived at the location earlier, with Carolyn appearing later than expected, a delay she attributed to traffic. An explanation the prosecution argued did not fit the conditions of a Sunday evening. The jury began deliberations on April 17th, 1991. But after extended discussion, they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, with 8 jurors favoring conviction and 4 holding out for acquittal, their disagreement shaped by the absence of eyewitnesses and the weight of competing interpretations. After 12 days, the judge declared a mistrial. A second trial followed, with most of the key figures remaining the same, though the defense team changed, bringing in William Aronwald, a former federal prosecutor, to replace Lewis. Public interest did not fade. The case continued to draw intense media attention, as familiar witnesses returned to the stand and the evidence was presented once again. On May 21st, 1992, the case was handed to the jury for a second time. After 6 days of deliberation, during which jurors requested transcripts, reviewed evidence, and sought clarification on legal points, they reached a unanimous decision. By the second trial, the designer clothes were gone, replaced by a university sweater and jeans. When the verdict was delivered, she struggled to remain steady. Judge Carey sentenced her to the maximum term of 25 years to life. Paul Salmon was not present in the courtroom. Once described as a privileged young woman with access to everything she wanted, she was transferred to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, where she would serve 27 years before being granted parole on June 17th, 2019. If this case stayed with you, leave a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you want cases that go deeper than the headlines. And let me know in the comments, do you think Carolyn acted alone? Or was there something the investigation never fully uncovered? New video coming this week.